In a modern skyscraper in downtown Chicago, the time was precisely 9 a.m., and the atmosphere in the tech company's lobby Future Horizons was already quivering from the daily hustle and bustle. Employees filed in and out, their faces marked with anticipation of another day of work, while the automatic doors opened and closed, creating a discreet symphony of metallic clanks and hurried footsteps. The fresh morning air, filtered through the enormous panoramic windows, mingled with the scents of espresso and freshly printed paper. The dynamic of the company was palpable, a hive of activity, a nerve center where every second counted. At the center of this sea of movement, a well-dressed man in his 40s in an impeccably cut black suit adjusted his tie carefully before entering the waiting room doors. His name was Thomas Bryant, a respected tech executive known for his expertise and keen eye on the digital future. But that day, he wasn't there to lead a meeting or supervise a team. He was there for a job interview, an interview for which he prepared with apparent calm, despite the truth hidden behind his appearance. Indeed, no one in the company knew that Thomas, under this candidate identity, was in reality the CEO of the company. For several months, rumors have been circulating about discriminatory practices in recruitment within Future Horizons. Anonymous testimonies circulated about unjustified preferences for certain profiles, young graduates from major universities, people with backgrounds seeming more in line with the image they wanted to project, while others, although highly qualified, were systematically excluded, often for no apparent reason. The accusations were serious. Applications for prestigious positions had been rejected without an interview, simply because of names deemed difficult to pronounce or ethnic origins perceived as less compatible with the cosmopolitan image that the company sought to maintain. Denunciations of these practices began to multiply, often in the form of anonymous emails, but the testimonies were consistent. An uneasiness, difficult to ignore, hovered in the ultra-modern offices. Thomas, aware of the seriousness of these allegations, made the decision to conduct his own investigation. Rather than relying solely on the reports he received from his managers or formal complaints sent through internal channels, he chose to take matters into his own hands. He wanted to see with his own eyes if these accusations were true, and to this end, he had taken on the identity of a simple candidate to observe the reality of the company from the inside. He knew this move might sow confusion among his teams. After all, why would a man of his caliber, a recognized leader in the technology sector, go to all this trouble? But it was precisely this incognito that allowed him to penetrate a universe that he could no longer see with the eyes of a CEO. By hiding under this appearance of a candidate, he hoped to be confronted with the truth, without the filters of management and the illusion of perfection. The company lobby seemed perfectly neat, almost too perfect, every employee in their place, each following the implicit rules of an invisible but rigid order. Through the window of the waiting room, Thomas could see the silhouettes of recruiters circulating around the offices, constantly discussing profiles, strategies, and future collaborators. But what about the reality behind the scenes, where decisions were made under sometimes dubious pretexts? It was this side that he wanted to see, without pretense, without strategy. The silence in the waiting room was heavy with meaning. The candidates there were focused, some reviewing their notes, others scanning their phones with anxious glances. Thomas suddenly felt disconnected from his usual identity, the powerful manager, the networker, the respected industrialist. There, in that room, he was just another man, judged on his appearance, his qualifications, his CV. And he knew that this anonymity gave him an unparalleled perspective on the company culture, on how the human resources team actually treated candidates. The door to the waiting room finally opened, and a woman in a black suit entered, heels clicking on the polished marble floor. His steps were assured, almost military in their cadence, as his gaze briefly scanned the room before settling on Thomas. She introduced herself as Jessica Hamilton, recruiting manager. Her gaze, quick and methodical, seemed to scan every detail of her appearance before inviting her in with a quick gesture of her hand, almost as if she had gotten into the habit of repeating this movement with millimeter precision. A too polite, almost frozen smile formed on his lips, a smile that failed to mask the constant assessment of his interlocutor. "Thomas, although confident in his role as candidate, immediately perceived the underlying coldness of this first contact. He stood and followed her wordlessly, his footsteps echoing down the impeccably lit hallway. She invited him to sit down with a precise gesture, indicating the chair in front of a large glass desk. Thomas sat down, adjusting his suit carefully before placing his hands on his knees, his gaze fixing on the brightness of the room. Light filtered through light fabric curtains, illuminating Jessica's face with an artificial glow. She took a seat across from him, settling behind his desk with a rigidity that seemed more related to personal control than any professional formality. Her fingers tapped briefly on her keyboard before settling on a folder neatly arranged in front of her. The calm in the room was almost palpable, but a slight unease hung in the air, perceptible even in the precision of his gestures. The conversation began in a pleasant tone, with the usual formalities of an interview following: greetings, thanks for his presence, and the inevitable question about his motivation. Thomas, while remaining calm, responded fluently, emphasizing his interest in the company and his desire to contribute to its development. But with each answer he gave, Jessica's gaze became more and more penetrating, almost too calculated, as if she were trying to decipher a riddle, searching for something more behind his words. His smile, still there, seemed to become more mechanical, diluting into a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. She asked him about his previous experiences, his ability to manage a team, and to face strategic challenges. Thomas responded confidently, talking about the many transformation projects he had led at other companies, the teams he had successfully led, the challenges he had overcome through forward thinking and keen acumen. Of innovation, he described the obstacles he faced and how he guided his teams through difficult times, using his ability to anticipate technology trends. But as the interview progressed, discomfort set in. Jessica, seemingly growing more defensive, began asking more pointed questions, her eyebrows furrowed, as if trying to gauge not just Thomas's skills, but his fit with the company. "You seem to have a very bold vision for someone of your background," she said almost mockingly, as if her success was an anomaly in the context of such a prestigious company. There was something cold in her voice, a hint of condescension carefully hidden behind well-chosen words, as if she were questioning not only her skills, but her very right to aspire to enter such an environment. "What I've learned is that boldness is often part of leadership," Thomas replied calmly, his calm gaze subtly defying the implications. He knew his words were carefully chosen, just as calculated as Jessica's, but he couldn't help but feel the sting of invisible but very real discrimination buried beneath the veneer of polite formulas. He felt the weight of judgment beneath every word, a judgment that had nothing to do with his skills, but rather with what he represented in Jessica's eyes. He did not let himself be disturbed, aware that he had to maintain his calm, because he was much more than just a candidate. He was the observer, the one who came to discover the truth. Then, like a clap of thunder, came the question that shook the air in the room. "Do you think you'll fit into our company culture? We are looking for someone who can not only lead, but also adapt to our dynamic." "I'm not sure that your profile completely matches what we're looking for." Jessica's tone had changed, taking on a new, more acerbic, more personal tone. The phrase seemed carefully constructed to highlight a difference, not in skill, but in compatibility. Thomas felt that the atmosphere in the room had changed. It was no longer a professional interview, but a subtle power play, where he was judged not for his skills, but for an invisible conformity expected of him. Thomas immediately understood the message. The culture Jessica was talking about didn't refer to technical skills or vision. No, the word encompassed much more than that. It referred to an implicit norm, a set of unwritten values that favored certain individuals while excluding others. This culture was not defined by objective criteria, but by subtle biases and judgments that played out well beyond the interview. What she was looking for was not just a competent leader, but a man who fit the company's image, an image dominated by social and cultural norms that excluded those outside of it. He knew that company culture was not a simple question of values or skills, but rather an invisible line drawn according to social criteria that perpetuated hierarchies of power and influence, favoring some over others. Others. Thomas felt increasingly aware of this gap. The dynamic Jessica was talking about was not about skills or leadership, but about conformity, a conformity that subtly masked discriminatory practices, invisible networks that controlled opportunities and closed the door to those who didn't fit in, even if their qualifications were indisputable. Without letting himself be destabilized, Thomas tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture. I understand, but I think that integration is first and foremost a question of mutual respect and opportunities for everyone, right? His voice was calm, measured, but each word carried a weight that seemed to cut through the tense atmosphere. He chose not to openly denounce the company culture, preferring to let the weight of his words weigh on the very meaning of the interview, on this notion of compatibility, which he had now well understood. His words were a mirror held up to Jessica, an invitation to reflect on the true nature of inclusion within Future Horizons. Jessica seemed unsettled by this response. Her eyes briefly moved away from Thomas, and she paused. For a split second, as if Thomas's words had shaken the carefully maintained balance of the room. However, she hastened to regain control, closing Thomas's file with a clean gesture and standing up abruptly, a precise and professional movement, but also marked by a form of closure. "We'll contact you if we decide to continue," she said, her voice now colder, and she deliberately avoided his gaze. He could almost hear the door to his mind closing, the conversation freezing in one final act of cold politeness. Thomas stood up too, his attitude still measured, but a glint of determination shone in his eyes. Instead of leaving the room, he calmly walked towards the elevator. There was no haste in his movements, not even a sign of frustration. The reality of the interview, uncomfortable as it was not the litmus test. He knew the real test was not what had just happened, but what came next. In the halls of Future Horizons, everyone thought they had seen a simple interview, an exchange between a candidate and a human resources manager. But for Thomas, this interview was just one step in a much larger plan, one that aimed to expose the truth of this culture behind closed company doors. Arriving in front of the elevator, Thomas hesitated for a moment before pressing the button, as if giving one last moment of reflection to assess the implications of what had just happened. An idea suddenly entered his mind. He hadn't just come to observe. He was there to upset this fragile balance. If he let this opportunity pass, then he would be part of the same culture he silently denounced. The real test was not what had just happened, but what came next. What had just happened in the interview room was only a preliminary step, a scene necessary to bring out the true essence of what was at stake. Thomas knew that the moment of truth had come, and it was not in the cold walls of the formal interview that he was going to make himself heard, but in this room where decisions were made, where truths became actions. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor, a space reserved for Future Horizons executives, a floor that seemed straight out of a futuristic vision. Large bay windows overlooking the city, sleek modern furniture, crisp blinds that exuded ambition and power. But behind this elegant decor hid the challenges that Thomas had detected from the first exchanges. He was not there to impress, but to shake the very foundations of the company. Thomas's assistant, a young man named Malik, was waiting for him in the lobby, a knowing smile on his lips. Malik did not need words to understand what was at stake in this moment. He knew that Thomas was going to redefine the space available to him. "Mr. Bryant, the team is waiting for you," he said, with this touch of complicity, as if he were a privileged witness to what was to come. His eyes shone with a certain pride, but also with apprehension, because he knew that this was not just a simple reunion. It was a moment of rupture. Thomas nodded, his mind already on the upcoming meeting. With every step he took, he felt the intensity of the situation. This room was the real playground, and this was no ordinary interview. In the meeting room, Future Horizons executives were already seated, their curious gazes fixed on him when he entered. The atmosphere, usually charged with nervousness or competition between them, immediately transformed into tacit respect upon his arrival. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the palpable tension. The moment he took his place at the head of the table, An atmosphere of respect immediately set in, a sort of heavy silence which weighed on the assembly, like a silent recognition of the importance of what was about to be said. They all knew they were about to face something much deeper than ordinary strategic discussions. "I have a story to tell you," Thomas began, his voice calm but sharp, his eyes scanning each member of the team. "Today I had an interview for a position at this company. An interview where, despite my experience and qualifications, I was clearly told that I was not what they were looking for." He paused, letting his words sink into the air, into the minds of those listening. Murmurs ran through the room, and a slight unease was felt among the leaders. Some looked away, others exchanged furtive glances, their faces expressing a mixture of discomfort and realization. Thomas raised his hand to silence them. He wasn't here to be interrupted, not this time. What struck me was not only the way in which I was dismissed, but the underlying culture that is conveyed here. A culture that suggests that certain profiles are more legitimate than others, that there are molds that you must fit to be accepted. His words were precise, measured, but each word struck like a blade. He knew this confrontation would be a moment of truth for everyone in this room. The leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding his gaze, others tensing with tension. Thomas noticed this, but he didn't give in. He was there to shake up their comfort, to expose what they were afraid to face. "This is not an isolated incident," he continued, his voice growing firmer, more resolute. "This is a systemic issue, and it starts here with us. We have a job to do." At that moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. The truths he had just revealed were too precise, too honest to be ignored. The tension was palpable in the air, a heavy silence that accompanied every word Thomas spoke. But he knew he wasn't going to back down. It wasn't just a moment of outrage. It was the opportunity to transform the situation, to make it productive. Then, Thomas slowly turned to Malik, who silently handed out documents detailing the interview he had just had. The team members took the sheets, their eyes sliding quickly over the contents, analyzing, reading between the lines, measuring the significance of what had just been said. "We have a problem to fix, and it's not just a recruiting problem," Thomas said in a quiet but determined voice. "It's a vision problem." These words were an invitation to rethink everything that had been put in place until now, to question the foundations of this company, to deconstruct the implicit standards that guided its decisions. Eyes met, but no one spoke immediately. The peace was suspended at this very moment, where a new direction could be taken. Thomas waited, his gaze slowly scanning the assembly, searching for a reaction, a sign of understanding or resistance. What he knew was that everything had changed. The power play, the unspoken norms, everything was going to be called into question. All that remained was to see who would be willing to follow him. Moments later, the door burst open, and Jessica walked in, looking confused, her steps hesitant. She had not anticipated this confrontation, and the whirlwind of questions swirling through her mind betrayed her incomprehension. She had no idea that this morning's interview had been nothing more than a carefully orchestrated test, a power play that would confront her with her own vision of the company. She had convinced herself that she would just have to evaluate one more candidate for a low-stakes position. However, what awaited him there, in this office, went far beyond the simple question of recruitment. Thomas, remaining impassive, got up from his seat and, with a precise gesture, invited him to sit down. His calm, almost distant posture contrasted with the intensity of the moment. He knew that what he was going to say could change the course of the conversation and, more importantly, change the direction of the company. He was not there to punish, but to awaken. "Do you remember our interview this morning?" he asked in a firm voice, but without aggression, each word weighing like an invitation to a reflection which was imposed on her. Jessica's gaze froze as she finally understood who he was. A glint of horror crossed his eyes, mixed with instant realization. She had had an interview with one of the most influential men in the company, but she had not recognized his voice or his name at the time, too focused on her own judgments. And now, there he was, in front of her, the man she had just judged, underestimated, the man she had taken for one candidate among many others. The gap between her thoughts and reality hit her hard. "I'm Thomas Bryant, CEO of Future Horizons," he said calmly, stating his identity with a simplicity that contrasted with the whirlwind of emotions he left behind. Silence immediately invades the room, heavy with all the unsaid revelations. Each word spoken seemed to weigh more, amplifying the unease and incomprehension that had settled in the room. Jessica's gaze wandered for a moment, searching for words, but she knew there were none left. This moment marked not only the end of a hiring process, but also the beginning of a profound change in the way the company perceived and treated its employees. Thomas knew this confrontation was only just beginning. He had not come to ask for an apology, nor to humiliate. His goal was bigger, more structured. Future Horizons was about to rethink its approach from the inside out. It was no longer simply a question of who would be selected for a position, but of creating an environment where the values of respect and inclusiveness were not just words, but concrete actions. The world of work could no longer afford to be a place of prejudices and stereotypes. Jessica felt a new tension invade her body. She had always believed she was in control of her position, seeing herself as a dedicated professional, a simple implementer of company decisions. But today, faced with this test that she had almost missed, she realized the extent of the gap between her perception and the reality that was hidden behind it. The lesson, for her, had just been given with devastating clarity. Thomas waited a few moments, letting the heavy air of the situation settle between them. Then, he continued in a more measured, calmer voice, but which now carried a new authority. "It's not just a test, Jessica. It's a reality that we all have to face. This morning, you have not evaluated a candidate, you have judged a man, and if this process continues like this, the company will continue to ignore talents who could also transform our vision." Jessica suddenly felt out of step with herself, trapped in the consequences of her own actions. She had not simply underestimated a candidate, she had participated, without knowing it, in a recruitment and management system which favored certain profiles and excluded others. It was no longer just a failure of maintenance, it was a failure of the very structure it served. Thomas looked at her one last time, his eyes no longer seeking to intimidate, but to convey a strong message. "This change, Jessica, begins with all of us. I invite you to think about what awaits you, because it is no longer just your decision. We will create together a future in which every talent has its place. But for this, we must first ask ourselves the question of our own view on what constitutes a candidate worthy of the name." The silence returned, even heavier than before, but this time it carried a promise. A promise of change.